So maybe you've heard people have said, if you can't solder, then FPV is not for you. Welcome to everyone. So today we're going to talk about soldering, and soldering is definitely part of the FPV hobby. So maybe you've heard people have said, if you can't solder, then FPV is not for you. Or perhaps you heard soldering is part and parcel of the FPV hobby. So these are, of course, truths. Definitely truths, because you really need to know how to solder if you are going to build your own drone. Well, with the new technology these days and bind and flies, or BNFs, what we call them, you don't really need to learn how to solder. All you need is a good radio, a good set of goggles, and a BNF drone, and you're set to go. And of course, not forgetting the lipos, the battery itself. But perhaps you've been spending a long time flying and you've been doing FPV for a while now, and you want to build your own drone and you want to build your own quad or quadcopter, but you want to build it your way. So the things you will need are, of course, a soldering iron. This is the TS100, and this is something that I would recommend. I would highly recommend either this or the pine seal soldering iron, soldering pen. No, it's like a pen, so it's like we call this a soldering pen, but you could get a standard soldering iron that will work, but this is something where you have the adjustable temperatures, so I would recommend this one. And if you get one of these or the pine seal soldering pen, then you won't be changing a soldering iron anytime soon. Plus, it's got a very fine tip, and these are replaceables. You can actually replace them and have an even finer tip, or perhaps you want a big one for different purposes and usage. So I've been using this TS100 for about, let's see, the last 5 years. The next thing you will need is a solder removing device, and this actually removes excess solder in case you have too much solder onto your pads. So this is something that you will need to actually remove the solder. Also, you will need a copper braided wire. So these are also used for removing excess solder on your work, or in this case your flight controller. And most importantly, solder itself. So this is a rosin activated core wire solder. I use 1mm solder for all my work. It's like not too thick and not too thin. There are different kind of thickness, so you might want to check that out. And of course, one of these, which is a soldering pen cleaner. This is the one with the copper thingy-majig. What do you call this? Copper wires inside, where you clean your pen while it's hot and just jab it in, and just that came out so wrong. NANI? No. So you just clean your soldering pen with this. I don't recommend the wet sponge method, because it's like one of these, and it's like you just wet the sponge and it'll expand, and after soldering you want to clean off the solder and you just dab it on the wet sponge and clean off the solder tip. But I don't really recommend this because it has a tendency to change the temperature of the soldering tip. So I use one of this, and this is much better. This is my personal opinion. I prefer this one. You can go ahead with the wet sponge method, whatever works for you. And one of the things that some people use, some people don't, but this is something that I recommend, and that's the soldering paste, also called flux. So if you use this together with this, you can go back in time. No, you can't. The flux really helps with the binding of the solder onto the copper pads, so this is something that I seriously highly recommend. And of course, there are other types of flux out there. There's also the flux pen, where it comes in the shape of a pen. You just dab onto the copper pads of your flight controller and then add on the solder, so that works too, but I prefer this one. Next is the actual process of soldering itself. So one other thing you might need is one of this silicone mat which is actually really good for soldering, and this is actually heat resistant, so it doesn't burn or anything like that. So first, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do the basic soldering stuff, and before we do all that, you just need to know that these are the pads that you will solder stuff on, and as I mentioned earlier, you need to have the flux placed onto the copper pad. So I don't really like to use the flux pen, so I use these Q-tips and rub a bit of flux and dab onto the copper pads for that particular specific pad that I want to actually solder on, like so. So I've set the soldering iron at 300 degrees Celsius, and I usually set them at 300 degrees Celsius because solder melts at 200 degrees. This I find is the most optimum for my TS100 soldering iron. So from here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna heat up the pads, the soldering pad, and we're gonna feed the solder onto the soldering iron or the pad itself. In between both, either is fine. If it doesn't stick, then just maneuver your way around until it does. There we go, and that's that. So once you have solder onto the pads, this will make a lot easier for when you're soldering your wires on. Now, another thing that you want to note is that you want to thin the wires with solder. What I like to do is I would use an X-Acto knife. I just cut a small section of the silicone protective around that wire and pull it off. And you have the wires exposed, that bit of wire exposed. You want to make sure that all the strands are nicely packed together by twisting them. You want to thin the wires by adding some flux. Then a little bit of solder here. And thin the wires with the solder. Just need to touch them and the flux will actually do its job. There you have it, and the wires all thinned. Alright, so next what we're going to do is we're going to heat up the solder that we placed onto the pad earlier on. I'm going to change the angle so this would be much better for me in this sense. I would hold the wires with a pair of tweezers because it turns really hot. It's 300 degrees. One method you can do is hold on to the iron onto the wires until both melts, or you could just heat up that pad with the solder on till that one melts, then feed the wire in. If that doesn't work, then it's a cold solder. So this, in this sense, it's not soldered properly. It sticks, but it doesn't stick fully. See that tip? You want to clean the tip with the solder cleaner, as I mentioned earlier, and there we have. Dip your soldering iron onto your solder paste. And hold on to the wires and that solder pad with your soldering iron until they both melt together. Now, if it's not really nice, what you could do is like add a little bit of solder, just a little bit, and do it again from the top of the wire. You want to do this a couple of times until you have that one silver blob of solder, like so. So that would give you a very nice solder and really solid hold. Now, you don't want to hold the soldering iron onto the pads for too long because it might screw up the pad itself. You might accidentally lift the pad because at some point there's a specific amount of temperature that the flight controller can actually take. Of course the pads as well. So you want to do it just enough for the solder to melt, and do it a couple of times until you get this nice clean solder blob like that. Next thing you want to take note of on flight controllers, or perhaps your ESCs, are that some of the flight controllers actually have built-in heat sinks. So it really takes a little bit more heat because the heat actually dissipates around the board. So when you're soldering ESCs, you might want to increase the temperature up to about 350 degrees. At least I do it up to 350 degrees because the moment I touch the solder pads, this is what's going to happen. The temperature is going to drop really fast. So in this sense, this one's actually an old flight controller, so I'm going to just use this for testing. So what we're going to do is, so this is set to 350 right now, and we're going to melt the solder on this side. As you can see, it takes a while to actually remove that piece off, and do the same on the other side. Or I'm just doing the reverse. You get we should actually be putting the XT connector on and not off. So I'm actually trying to remove this. Takes a bit of effort here for the solder to melt. So once it's melted, you can actually have this removed. Now see the temperature dropping on my soldering pen. That's one of the reasons why I set it to 350, so that I could actually have this removed. There we go. So these are things that you want to take note of for flight controllers or ESCs that has this bigger pads. For the LiPo connectors, just gonna clean that up a little bit, making sure that nothing touches anything. So perhaps some of these flight controllers have got this really small copper pads that are meant for really small drones like the tiny Whoop. You might want to consider getting one of these, which is a digital microscope where you can actually use to see your flight controller. Let's get that. There we go. So you can actually get the proper visualization on your pads and see how well your wires are soldered, because the most important thing is that you don't want your wires to be frayed up, or in this sense don't want any scraggles of your wires to be touching another pad, because then there's a high risk of you shorting out your flight controller. So this is what I'm talking about. You don't want your wires to be like this when you thin the wires, so there's a high chance that some of these stray wires might be touching another pad in this sense, and this will definitely cause a short to something else. So you have to be very careful when you're soldering these wires on, which is one of the reasons why a microscope would actually help really well. So when you thin your wires, just make sure all these scraggles are nicely tucked in, and twist. One of the reasons why I said twist the wires, so you don't have any of these scraggles. And then add the flux and thin the wires so that your builds will be very clean and you have this nice shiny solder block like that. Alright, so that's it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I hope you find this information useful. So if you do, please do give a like and subscribe. It will really help us a lot. And till the next video, thank you all for watching and see you guys again soon. Ciao!